Jane Frericks asks, if a Westerner wanted to experience life under an anti-imperialist government today, which country would you recommend spending time in? That's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question, Jane. Because let me just point this out. In the 1970s, the 1980s, North Korea and Cuba had almost exactly the same political and economic system. Did you know this? They were both Soviet-aligned Marxist governments. They were slightly more radical than the Soviet Union. They were aligned with third world liberation struggles. They were close to Libya and Gaddafi. They were, Gagarin, I guess you could say. They were to the left of the Brezhnev government in the Soviet Union. But Americans loved Cuba. All right, a lot of Trotskyites had it in their head that Cuba was great. Cuba is a genuine socialist country, but North Korea was always hated by Americans. Other than the Workers' World Party and the Communist Party USA, North Korea was completely shunned. And it's weird because they had the exact same political system. They had a cult of personality around their leader. They had a one-party Communist Party ruling. They were aligned by the Soviet Union. The apartment buildings even looked the same. The mass housing that they constructed with Soviet assistance, they had the apartment buildings looked the same. But American leftists, they loved Cuba, and they did not like North Korea. And Michael Parenti, who is a brilliant writer, pointed out that they basically had the same economic system. And so why does Cuba get a pass with American leftists and North Korea doesn't? Well, there's cultural differences. Cultural differences. Korean culture is much more foreign to Americans than Cuban culture is. We've got Latin folks here in America, right? We have Latinos here in America. We like to drink rum in America. We like salsa music. And a lot of American leftists can go to Cuba and they can drink the rum and they can listen to the salsa music and they can go, this isn't so bad. But a lot of Americans, they get to North Korea and they see the military parades and they see the big pictures of Kim Il-sung everywhere and the mountains and the cold, the snow in the mountains, and they get scared. It's the same political and economic system, but they perceive it differently. And in fact, both Cuba and North Korea, prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, had a kind of an ideological moment. In Cuba, they called it the rectification campaign. In North Korea, they called it the Cultural Revolution. But both of them, as the Soviet Union was falling, they had like an ideological rearmament. And they both suffered devastatingly after the fall of the Soviet Union. Cuba, they called it the special period. There were food shortages. They didn't have enough electricity. North Korea, they called it the arduous march. People started to starve to death. North Korea and Cuba, it's basically, now Cuba is much further along in terms of economic reforms because they have control of their whole country. The whole island is under the leadership of the Communist Party, and they're able to get more foreign investment. Whereas North Korea, half the country is occupied by the United States. The country is still divided, and so North Korea is still pretty isolated. North Korea has had to proliferate nuclear weapons. So North Korea hasn't been able to move ahead on the market reforms as much as North Korea has. But the reason I'm telling you this, Jane, is because it's weird. Americans go to Cuba and have continued to go to Cuba and think highly of Cuba. And Americans, North Korea always scared them. That points to how important kind of cultural differences is. Cuba is much more like America culturally than North Korea is. It has nothing to do with the economic and political system. It's pretty much the same economic and political model. That shows you that I always tell the story that when I went to the Global Communist Youth Festival in Ecuador, the North Koreans, right, they hugged us, Americans. Like as soon as they saw us, they just like threw their arms around us. And the reason that they did that, the reason that they did that is because in Korean culture, you don't hug. Koreans don't hug. That's just a thing. That Koreans, they just don't do that, right? However, even they had been trained because in Latin America, people are there's a lot of affection in Latin American culture, right? A lot of hugging, a lot of kissing and stuff. And so the Koreans had been trained basically to show affection. That wasn't natural to them because they were going to Ecuador, they were going to Latin America, right? And that kind of shows these things. But look, Jane, look, all of these countries, and you have to be very careful. And I just pointed out to you that North Korea and Cuba have a very different culture, and that means that the way people from the West react to it is going to be very different, but the same overall economic system. And you asking me this question, Jane, puts me in a very difficult position, because of the fact, Jane, that all of these countries are unique. The people in these countries have their own traditions, their own cultures, their own way of doing things, their own food, their own music, their own perspective, their own unique historical circumstances. And none of these countries appreciate being compared or likened or paralleled to other countries. They don't like that, right? Even that comparison I just made to Cuba and North Korea. There are probably Cubans that are deeply offended by what I just said. And there's probably North Koreans that are deeply offended by what I just said. People don't like that. I gotcha, Cam. I gotcha. You're on the list. People don't like that. People do not like that, right? How would you like it if someone came, you're from New Zealand? What if someone said, "Oh, New Zealand and Australia are exactly the same. Your accents are similar," and you would get very angry, right? Because New Zealand and Australia, there may be some similarities, right? But you're not the same. You're not the same people, right? You both might like Vegemite, right? That's a food that I think a lot of you like. New Zealanders like it, and Australians both like it. But New Zealand and Australia are culturally very different. New Zealand is much more social democratic and much more friendly to China. Australia is much closer to the United States, much more free market and oriented. New Zealand is much nicer to its indigenous people than Australia has been historically. Not that their record is perfect. I mean, it's there's a whole. I mean, New Zealand and Australia are not the same country, right? It's not the same. And New Zealanders resent Australia. If I'm not mistaken, in the Australian Constitution, there's actually sections that allow Australia to annex New Zealand. And New Zealanders really don't appreciate that. They really don't appreciate that. And that, New Zealanders and Australians, they might sound the same. There may be some cultural overlap, but they don't like it. Neither of them like it. Australians don't like it if you think they're New Zealanders. New Zealanders don't like it if they're Australians. So you have to be really careful, right? You're asking me, if you wanted to experience life in an anti-imperialist country, which one should you go to? And what I'm telling you, Jane, is that all of these countries are unique. They all have their own history, right? And they're all different. The similarities flow from the way their economic and political system is different than the Western or neoliberal economic and political system. And that's where the similarities stop, right? And that there are certain similarities. Look, all of these governments, all anti-imperialist governments, depend on a well-organized population in order to stay in power. The Iranian government would not be in power for 2 days if they didn't have the Basij Council and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and all kinds of Iranians who swear allegiance to the supreme leader, Khamenei, and are ready to lay down their lives for Khamenei and enforce the will of Khamenei on a community and local level. And I've seen that with my own eyes. I've seen what the Basij councils look like. I've seen what the Revolutionary Guards are like. And that's why they're still in power. And, Daniel Ortega wouldn't be in power for 2 minutes in Nicaragua if it weren't for the Citizens Power Councils, the Sandinista youth leagues, the revolutionary community militias. They have got a well-organized population, community assemblies that have their back. That's a similarity. But are Nicaragua and Iran similar in any other way? Well, they're Muslims in Iran. They're Christians in Nicaragua. Iran is in the Middle East. Nicaragua is in Central America. I mean, both of them are anti-imperialist countries. Both of them had a popular revolution in 1979. That's about it, though. That's really about it. They trade with each other. Iran and Nicaragua are very close. And their economic system, where the state controls the means of production, but there's a private sector that flourishes, a lot of private hotels, a lot of restaurants, but the state kind of controls and subsidizes businesses and plans to make sure living standards continue to rise. 21st century socialism, and they don't even call it socialism in Iran. They call it, not capitalism, but Islam, the resistance economy, the Islamic resistance economy. They insist it's neither socialist nor capitalist. In Nicaragua, they call it Sandinista Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. But, neither of them are Marxists, right? In the classical sense, they're religious governments. The Sandinistas, the opening preamble of their constitution references Christianity in the Bible and says that they are true Christians practicing their faith in socialism. The Islamic Revolution of Iran, they denounce Marxism. Marxist parties are illegal in the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is an Islamic country. But the similarities in their political system, I just listed them, but that ends there. It absolutely ends there, right? Beyond those similarities, community assemblies are an ideological wing of the military, the government that comes out of the popular revolution that plans out the economy. Other than that, the similarities end. Iran and Nicaragua look nothing like each other. They're culturally completely different. The Persian people and the Nicaraguan people couldn't be more different from each other. And people don't like it when you make those kind of comparisons. People don't appreciate it because they feel like almost kind of like you're belittling their country's independence. And I've learned that the hard way. I've tried to make comparisons before as an American on the outside, and people don't like it. Right? Mitchell Sparks, he must be agreeing with me. I think he's a Russian, and he knows what that's like. When we Americans, we show up and we're like, oh, yes, Russia, you're kind of like China. You're kind of like Uzbekistan. You don't like that. People don't like that. That's kind of an ugly American thing to do, right? And we leftists, we feel like we have a license to do it. Those of us who understand Marxism and all that, we feel like we have a license because we're doing it from a Marxist perspective. It's still not appreciated, right? So I'm careful with that. I'm very, very careful with that. I'm very careful with all of that. But look, what I've come to realize, and this is a stray from the Marxist orthodoxy, right? What I've come to realize is that every country that is anti-imperialist is more or less socialistic. And that is just something that happens, right? People ask me, Caleb, Russia is a capitalist country. And I say, they definitely aren't communist anymore. They're not run by the Communist Party. They don't call their economy socialist. There was a huge amount of free market stuff in the 90s that devastated the country. The country was clearly dominated by the West and all of that. But Putin came into power as kind of a Bonapartist, was going to stabilize the economy, had the backing of the security services and other forces. And he recentered the economy around two state-run energy companies, Gazprom and Rosneft. And now, especially since the war in Ukraine has escalated, March of 2022, the Western countries have all barricaded Russia. So Russia's economy it's not doing business with the Western capitalist financial system very much. It's been pretty locked out of it. Now, India still does business with them. The Saudis still do business with them. Israel still does business with them. Brazil still does some business with them. But they've been largely barricaded and locked out of the Western capitalist economy. Meanwhile, they're doing business with China, guns blazing, going gangbusters doing business with China. They're doing business with Vietnam. They're doing business with North Korea. They're doing business with Cuba. They just built a statue of Fidel Castro in Moscow. They're doing business with Venezuela. They're doing business with Iran. They're doing business with Nicaragua. And so you can tell me, oh, well, Russia's not socialist, Caleb. And you're probably right? There's a lot of income inequality there. There's a capitalist class that's very wealthy, and the government is kind of working with them and protects them. But there's a huge amount of state control and Bonapartism in Russia. I mean, the government, very much controls the economy, very much so. I mean, it's not a laissez-faire economy. I mean, it's very much, the economy is centered around two state-run energy companies. There's economic planning. There's a state-run titanium company. There's a state-run airline. There's a huge amount of state involvement in the economy. And all the countries that it trades with are all socialist countries. So you tell me that Russia is not a socialist country. Okay, I'm not saying you're wrong. But if it was, how would it be different? How would it be different if it was socialist? And you say, well, there wouldn't be as much inequality. Well, there's inequality in China. There's a new billionaire created every day in China. China's a socialist country. right? So I don't think, and they say, well, if it was a socialist country, they'd be preaching Marxist ideology. They don't believe in Marxist ideology anymore. The Communist Party does, but the bulk of the Russian state, Russian Orthodox, they're proud of the achievements of the Soviet Union. Stalin is very popular in Russia. He's a national hero. 75% of Russians say the Soviet Union was the best time in their history, but they don't believe in Marxism. They are now a religious government. They have the Russian Orthodox Church as their state religion. They reject atheistic Marxism. They honor the czar as being martyred by the Bolsheviks. So okay, but Gaddafi in Libya, did he preach Marxism? I mean, he said it was not, it was Islamic socialism. He rejected Marxism in his green book. He said it was Islamic socialism. In Iran, they also reject Marxism, but Iran is clearly not a capitalist country. I mean, so it's like, okay, so you say Russia's not a socialist country. I mean, okay, I'm not going to disagree with you. I mean, the Russians don't think they're a socialist country, and they're not. I mean, they've repudiated Marxism. They reject the Soviet Union. The leadership that's in power doesn't want to ever bring the Soviet Union back. But it's like, what does that even mean? What does that even mean? And that's where we're getting to the essence of why I wrote my book, City Builders and Vandals, why I wrote the We Are City Builders manual. Like, we're in a new ball game, and you can't do the Cold War thing where you're like, that's a communist, that's a capitalist. It's not that simple anymore. And what about these countries in Africa? A lot of countries in Africa that have never had a revolution, never had a change in property relations, but China is investing in them like crazy with its state-run companies, and it's building up their state-run industries, and their economy is very closely tied in with China's economy. And, they're very small in terms of GDP because they're underdeveloped African countries, and they're tied in with China and socialist China, and they're tied in with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. And, I mean, this kind of points to, in a weird kind of way, when Trotsky was talking about permanent revolution, his argument was, he said, you can't really have socialism in one country because that country is going to trade on the global market. Well, Trotsky's not completely wrong in saying that, right? And that the line, this is a socialist country, this is not a socialist country. Look, people I think even Lenin didn't realize how important what he wrote in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, was. Because what Lenin was saying is, we're not fighting capitalism anymore. We're fighting imperialism. And socialism is going to come into the world on the basis of whole nations fighting to break out of imperialism. That's what Lenin's writing in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that the capitalist global economy has changed to the point that the main enemy is not a factory owner struggling against his employees. The main enemy is this global financial system backed up by the Western government, centralized in Western banking institutions that dominates the world and holds back development. And the revolutionary energy, because of the stratification and the division of the working class in the Western countries, the revolutionary energy is going to be in the third world. It's going to be in the colonized countries of the world, struggling to break out of that system. And it won't just be the factory workers, the industrial workers of those countries. It's going to be the peasants. It's even going to be the capitalists of those countries, the national capitalists. And it's going to be struggles for national liberation from the domination of imperialism. It's going to create socialism. That's what Lenin writes, and he was clearly right. That's what happened in the 20th century. But then that raises the question. What is socialism? And that every country that breaks out of Western domination, more or less, has to align with communist governments around the world. Every country that breaks out of Western domination has to have a somewhat centrally planned economy. Every country that breaks out of Western capitalism, if you don't change the nature of the state, if your military doesn't become a revolutionary military, we saw this in Bolivia, right? They didn't change the military. The economy was largely socialistic, but the military was still dominated by pro-U.S. people. And so they had the coup and they were able to remove Evo Morales. If you don't change the nature of the military, you don't stay in power. So you have to change the nature of the state. And on top of that, every country that breaks out of imperialism more or less has to have a centrally planned socialistic economy. So we're in a whole new ballpark. And that's when I talk about city builders and vandals. What is socialism? For Western social democracy, socialism is the government giving people free stuff in order to stabilize the Western capitalist homelands so they can spread imperialism all over the world. That's what AOC's socialism is. This is, this is important stuff. I have, in my new book, I have this essay as an appendix, three socialist movements. Social democracy, the Marxism of Karl Marx, the Marxism of Engels devolved into the Marxism of Karl Kautsky, the Marxism of the British Labour Party, the Marxism of AOC, the Marxism of Denmark and Sweden. Social democracy means that in order to make sure that this Western financial system can dominate the world, we set up methods of stabilization. We have some nationalized industries here and there. We give people some free health care. We give people some free education so that we have the stability in the homeland that we need to dominate the planet. And that's social democracy. It's social imperialism. And that is AOC's socialism. That's Bernie Sanders' socialism. That's DSA's socialism. That our Western system can be more stabilized and can more effectively dominate the world if we do it smart. If the ultra rich, the Fabian Society in Britain, H.G. Wells, if we can stabilize this, if we can have the ultra rich impose controls, set up a welfare state, and we can kind of stabilize the Western system, it'll be more effective in dominating the world. That's social democracy. Fascism, fascism is another variation of that. It's the less nice version of that. Social democracy uses socialistic and Marxist language and tries to give people free stuff and is patting you on the head and says, we care about you. Fascism is big, mean, and scary. And fascism says we are going to forcibly degrow. We're going to create an underclass of slave laborers. We're going to commit genocide against sections of our population. We're going to completely militarize the economy. But ultimately, it's an effort to do the same thing, to stabilize the Western imperialist system so it can better dominate the world. German imperialism had been stripped of its colonies after World War I. And the only way it could get it back was the, German banker, Hjalmar Schacht, the Krupps, the Tysons. They picked Hitler and they set up a fascist movement in order to impose heavy-handed control on the economy, to forcibly degrow sections of the population, militarize the economy so that they could re-seize their colonies. And that led to World War II. Same thing in Italy, right? Italy started, seizing colonies, Libya and Ethiopia, etc. And it's really social democracy and fascism. Neither of them are actually socialism. They're both attempts to stabilize the Western capitalist system with a heavy hand, with state control, in the hopes of strengthening imperialism. So social democracy, which is Marxism watered down and turned into a method for imperialism. Fascism, which is authoritarian right-wing Bonapartism. Both of them are not really socialism. But what socialism actually is, it started with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when the Bolsheviks took power. The first thing they did is they convened the Congress of the Peoples of the East. It was in Baku in Azerbaijan. You know who attended the Conference of the Peoples of the East? I'm going to start crying now. I get emotional about this stuff, because it's so pivotal. I've been attacked and smeared because I understand this, because I believe in this stuff. What was the first thing the Bolsheviks did after they took power? Well, not one of the first things, but it's one of the early things they did. They had a conference in Baku in Azerbaijan. And they invited people from China, and they invited people from Central Asia, and they invited people from Africa. The Conference of the Peoples of the East. They said, we will support anybody who fights against the colonialists. We'll support anyone who fights against the imperialists. Vladimir Lenin made friends with the Emir of Afghanistan. You think the Emir of Afghanistan was a communist? The Emir of Afghanistan, he was the king of Afghanistan, not a leftist, not a liberal, a conservative if there ever was one, an authoritarian, brutal, right-wing leader, the Emir of Afghanistan. I will link you. I will show you. This is an article. I'm dropping it in the chat. I will read it out loud to you. This is an article that Lenin, this is 1919. Very short. Comrade Lenin met with the ambassador in his private office, the ambassador of Afghanistan, with the words, "I am very glad to see in the red capital of the worker and peasant government the representative of the friendly Afghan people who are suffering and fighting against imperialist oppression." To which the ambassador replied, "I proffer you a friendly hand and hope that you will help the whole of the East to free itself from the yoke of European imperialism." During the talk that followed, Lenin said that Soviet power, the power of the working people and the oppressed, was striving toward the very goal the Afghan ambassador extraordinary had spoken about, but that it was necessary that the Muslim East should realize this and help Soviet Russia in her great war of liberation. To this, the ambassador replied that he could assert that the Muslim East realized this, and the hour was not far off when the world would see that there was no room for European imperialism in the East. Afterwards, the ambassador stood up, and with the words, he said, "I have the honor of presenting my sovereign letter to the head of the free Russian proletarian government, and the hope that the Soviet government will give due consideration to the Afghan government in writing this." And he handed Lenin the emir's letter. Comrade Lenin answered the letter that he accepted the letter with the greatest pleasure and promised shortly to give a reply to all questions of Afghanistan. The government of the Bolsheviks established relations with the Emir of Afghanistan, and they even offered military support to the Emir of Afghanistan because he was fighting the imperialists. He was fighting the British. They liked him, and they made friends with the Emir of Afghanistan. And that what started with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, it was already different than what classical Marxism had done. Vladimir Lenin, he formed a party of new type. This party of new type, the Bolshevik Party. And a lot of people said this isn't a normal Marxist party. This is a cult. This is a monastic order. This is a religious sect. You're demanding people give the whole of their lives. You're operating like a religious organization. You're operating in secret. You're using methods from the Decembrists, from the old believers. This is like a Russian secret society that you're forming. And Lenin said, we're doing it different in Russia. He came up with this whole new model of how to form a new party. What is to be done? The vanguard party. And it wasn't the Western Marxists. They didn't like it. They said, this is weird. This is authoritarian. This is we don't like this. This is not the Western way of doing things. And they said, that's because we're in Russia. We're doing it our own way. And Lenin looked at the Western Marxist parties and said, these are debating societies. You're ultra-democratic. You're fighting over the resolution. You're wasting our time. We're forming a Marxist combat party, a party of new type. A party of new type. That's what they called the Bolshevik Party. It was a non-Western thing. It was a break from Western Marxism. And then when the Soviet Union came into existence, they started supporting people in Africa, supported Marcus Garvey. They supported Afghanistan against the British. They wanted to support anybody who would fight the imperialists. They made friends with Dr. Sun Yat-sen. They gave military training to Chiang Kai-shek. And it was a new thing that came into existence that was rejecting the Western imperialist system. That's what it was. What started with Bolshevism, it was this new form of socialism that was saying we reject this global imperialist financial system of the West. And so because of that, we are going to align with anyone who will fight against it. And we realize that the people that break out of this Western financial capitalist system, it's going to be whole countries fighting for their national liberation who will break out of this system. So that is what we're going to do. Stalin is a step further. Stalin comes into power. And Stalin says, yeah, we're not going to, spread communism to the West. It's not going to happen. There's not going to be a revolution in Germany. There's not going to be a revolution in Britain. So we got to build socialism in one country. And Stalin, he says, look, he outlaws abortion. He outlaws homosexuality. And he starts modeling the aesthetics of the Soviet state on the Russian Orthodox Church. Right? They have pictures of Lenin everywhere, the halo around his head. Right? And Stalin is like the new czar. He's the great leader. He's the symbol of the nation. But he goes around encouraging people to work hard to industrialize the country. Women are working in factories alongside women are getting an education, becoming leaders of the military. It's a change, but it's a compromise with the old system. And you can see elements of czarism, feudalism in it, but you can also see elements that are super modern. Right? Women in the military, women becoming electrical engineers, making great films like Eisenstein. It's a weird synthesis. Stalin takes it a little bit further. After Stalin dies, you have the Chinese Revolution. Mao, who'd originally been an anarchist from the peasantry, he'd studied the Taiping Rebellion, the Taiping Uprising. Mao becomes the leader of Chinese communism, even though the Soviet Union didn't like him. They tried to fire Mao on many different occasions, right? They, after Mao and the Chinese Soviet Republic were defeated, and they had to retreat after the Chinese Soviet Republic was crushed by Chiang Kai-shek, the Soviet Union, the Comintern tried to impose, I think it was the 28 Bolsheviks on China, these 28 guys that had been trained in Moscow, and the Soviet Union said, these are the new bosses. And Mao said, over my dead body, ripped up the letter. Mao was in charge of the Red Army. And those 28 Bolsheviks, they didn't stand a chance. And, the Chinese Revolution was uniquely Chinese. And it developed its own methods, the mass line, criticism, self-criticism. It develops all kinds of uniquely Chinese ways of doing things, right? The Chinese Revolution is not a copy of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution is not Western Marxism. The Chinese Revolution is unique. Right after the death of Mao Zedong, they start talking about socialism with Chinese characteristics. We can have a mixed economy, but the state must control the means of production. We can't have the chaos of the market, but we can have foreign investment. We can have free trade zones. We can have the market mechanisms, but the Chinese Communist Party is going to stay in power. The Soviet Union falls. The Chinese Communist Party stays in power. And socialist countries around the world realize that if they want to make socialism flourish, they need to be more like China. Vietnam adopts similar measures with their socialist-oriented market economy. Cuba is becoming more like China every day. North Korea wants to be more like Cuba. The Bolivarian revolutions happen in South America, and they're not traditional Marxist revolutions, right? It's they polarize the country. Are you for neoliberal cutbacks and domination by the Western bankers, or are you against it? And the communist parties and the national capitalists and the indigenous people, they form a bloc and they're able to get elected, but then they change the nature of the military. The Venezuelan military is trained in Cuba. They have a very big state sector in Venezuela, but the government controls the oil, and the government heavily controls and subsidizes the private sector and forces it to do what's in accordance with the overall state central plan. This is, the Sandinistas come back to power in Nicaragua on a similar platform where, they're polarizing the country. Are you for neoliberalism? Are you against it? They get back in power. They with their citizens power councils and their micro entrepreneurship programs, state central planning, they're able to kind of build an economy where profits are not in command, but a very big flourishing market sector. We're seeing socialism has left Europe. It is broken. Right? Socialism has come into existence. Socialism exists around the world, but it's not the socialism of Western factory workers rising up and seizing their factories. That's not what it is. It is whole nations breaking out of the domination of Western imperialism and forming a new economy around the world that's based on growth and central planning. And that is socialism. Marx was right in pointing to the problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profits and the instability of the capitalist system. He was right about that. Lenin was right in pointing out that capitalism had moved into its monopolistic imperialist stage and that whole nations were being subsidized, and that it would be the colonized people of the world that would create socialism because the revolutionary energy would no longer be in the West, because social democracy and the Marxist movement and the labor movement had turned into their opposites, had become mechanisms for stabilizing Western capitalism. Marx was right, Lenin was right, Stalin was right, realizing that in order to develop a system that was going to work in countries of the East, you couldn't, just have it be a Western open liberal society. You had to have some modernism, but you had to have some appeal to tradition. You had to model it in a certain way. 5-year economic plan. Stalin largely innovates what we consider to be the communist system during the Cold War. But Deng Xiaoping was right as well. And he said that Stalin model is good for about a generation. It gets you over the first hurdle. It industrializes the country. It electrifies the country. It builds the country up. But after you get to that point, you need market mechanisms, things like consumer goods. It doesn't handle so well. When it comes to the tech sector, you need innovation. So you need to have markets and you need to focus on economic growth. You can't redistribute poverty. You can't have everyone be equal in poverty. No, you have to focus on growth and building up the economy, right? And the goal is to create a world with so much wealth and abundance that inequality can fade away. But the goal must be raising living standards. Poverty is not socialism. To be rich is glorious, right? Deng Xiaoping was right. Bolivarianism is right. What they did in Latin America, appealing to the traditions of indigenous people and appealing to Christianity, creating a unique melding of different strands of their society to develop a model of socialism that would be applied to Latin America. It's brilliant. Islamic Revolution of Iran is brilliant. The construction jihads that were mobilized by Khomeini to go out and build up the country, not capitalism, but Islam, using the religious fervor of the Iranian people and the anti-imperialism, the hatred for the Western colonizers, the celebration of their tradition, of their religion, and the martyrdom and the sacrifice, and the Shia tradition of standing with the oppressed. All of this is brilliant. Anti-imperialism has created a new economy. The BRICS, the Belt and Road, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Bolivarian alternative of Latin America. There is another economy in the world today. And that economy doesn't just exist within the borders of these countries. It exists beyond the borders. It's all over Africa. There are countries that are trading with this new economy. All over the African continent it exists. All over the Middle East. They call it the axis of resistance. You got the Houthis in Yemen. You got Hezbollah in Iran. You got, a big section of Iraq that is tied in with the Iranian economy. You've got, even Afghanistan now is starting to do business with China, and it's complicated. The Taliban, it's a push and pull, but it's complicated. But something new is happening. Something new is happening. And if you just are stuck in the past, and if you just want to play this game like it's the 1980s, and you can be like, well, that's a communist government. That's a Marxist-Leninist communist government aligned with the Soviet Union. And that ain't. You're missing the boat. You're missing the boat. And there's a lot of people who want to look at Venezuela. They want to look at Iran. They want to look at Nicaragua. They even want to look at China, Cuba, and they want to shout at them. They say, well, you're not the way it's supposed to be. You're not the way it's supposed to be. Maybe they aren't. But what is the way it's supposed to be? The way it's supposed to be is that this whole imperialist system is supposed to be gone. The way it's supposed to be is that these countries aren't supposed to be kept in chronic poverty so that Wall Street bankers can keep their monopoly. The way it's supposed to be is the whole world is supposed to be trading with everybody else, and we're all supposed to be rising out of poverty, and we're supposed to have a global economy where we use resources in a rational way, where we strategically orient things so that technology leads to a better, more fulfilling, and beautiful life for everybody. The way it's supposed to be is full communism. They don't have that in China. They don't have that in Korea. They don't have that in Latin America. So you can point at the anti-imperialist states that exist and shout, that's not the way it's supposed to be. Great. And what does that achieve? What are you achieving by doing that? I'm talking about what exists. There are two forces in the world today. There are two camps that exist, and they don't want it that way. We don't want to divide the world into camps. We don't want a new Cold War, but that's the way it's becoming. There's an anti-imperialist economy in the world today, and there is the dying Western financial system that is trying to impose degrowth and starvation and depopulation in order to keep itself in power because it can't handle human progress. Because human progress can't be crammed into the irrational restraints of a profit-oriented system. So there's one section of the world that has broken out of that profit-oriented Western system, that is marching ahead, and there is a dying, irrational, vicious Western system run by the World Economic Forum and the big banks and the big super major oil companies and the Silicon Valley tech monopolists, the Silicon Valley fascists. And they're trying to stay on top of the world by keeping it poor. Imagine a game of King of the Mountain. Right? You ever play King of the Mountain when you're a kid on a little hill? Imagine one kid gets to the top and he says, now the game is over. The game must end now because I'm at the top. That's what the Western imperialists are doing. The game must end because they are at the top. I'll get to you, Molly. Don't worry. That's what's happening in the world today. And the game isn't going to end. And humanity is not going to stop. We're not going to stop having children. We're not going to stop inventing new technology. We're not going to stop raising countries out of poverty. We're not going to stop industrializing. We're not going to stop. Humanity will not stop. And that's very American, right? That's some of that motor-mindedness, Anna Louise Strauss. That's what America used to always be about, right? We were a land of immigrants, of people who go and start their own businesses and achieve their dreams. And we go out and we build and we construct. We're motor-minded. We're associated with action. We get things done. That's the American way. Africa is becoming more American. China is becoming more American. Russia is becoming more American. Latin America is becoming more American. And here in America, they're trying their hardest to cram the genie back into the bottle. They're trying to tell us you can't be American, you can't be motor-minded, you can't be optimistic, you can't be hopeful, you can't be entrepreneurial anymore because we got to save capitalism. Because we got to save our system, we got to save the planet, we got to save whatever. That's what they think it is. That's the reality of the world that we face in our time. Growth is battling degrowth. Socialism of a different type, whatever started in 1917, looks completely different now, but it started in 1917. Something that started in 1917 and has gone through a lot of different leaps and evolutions is still alive and is flourishing. And the Western system that tried social democracy, that tried fascism, is crashing and burning. And that's what's going on in our world today. And so the question is, which side are you on? I can answer that question very easily. I'm on the side of the emerging economy. I'm on the side of human growth and creativity. I'm on the side of rising and growing and eliminating poverty and eliminating scarcity and expanding the human population and achieving new heights of creativity. That's the side I'm on. And that's the American way. right? That's nothing more American, nothing more patriotic than that. That's, I might as well be eating a hot dog. I might as well have the American flag behind me and the Battle Hymn of the Republic playing, right? This doesn't get more American than that. I'm on the American side, but America is no longer American. That motor-mindedness, that optimism, that hope people used to associate with America is gone from the American leaders. Now they're preaching pessimism and death. Now they're preaching degrowth. When I went to Yalta, to the World Economic, not the Yalta Economic Forum, not the World Economic Forum, the Yalta Economic Forum, when I listened to what the leaders said at the World Festival of Youth and Students in Sochi, Russia in 2017, I listened to Putin talk to the kids about their science projects, when I listened to Jack Ma speak at the Valdi Discussion Club and explain why he's optimistic about technology despite the problems created by computers, this is what's going on in the world today. There are two systems that are at war with each other. They shouldn't be at war with each other. And in fact, what is happening in Asia and Africa and Latin America is that they're starting to have what America used to have, that growth and innovation, that optimism. And I love America. I love the American people. It took me a while. I had to get through my 20s. I had to get through my alienation. I had to deal with my own personal trauma, my own personal history. But I love America. I love Jesus Christ. And I see what's going on in the world today. And I see that deep in our souls, we Americans, we have more in common with what's happening in Russia and China and Venezuela and Vietnam and Iran than we do with what's happening over here. Our society is sick. People are killing themselves. People are dying of opioids. They're shooting heroin into their veins and dying. Our roads are falling apart. This isn't what America is supposed to be. Yes, America was founded on slavery and racism. Yes, America has an ugly, ugly history. But the reason that America prevailed, despite all that evil, was because of that hope, that optimism, that action-oriented motor-mindedness. And that is what they're trying to beat out of us right now. They are trying to beat our Americanism right out of us right now. And they're trying to beat our American out of us now. They're trying to poison us with our phones, pessimism, hopelessness, climate anxiety. They are trying to de-Americanize America so that they can save their system. When what we Americans want, when I go to Yalta Economic Forum, when I go to I've been there, right? I've been to Iran. I was in Brazil at the conference, the World, the World Trade Union Center. Eurasia is growing there, and it's that desire to grow. It's the desire that we're going to have the state control the means of production. The state will organize the economy to make sure that we grow, to make sure that human creativity and innovation is, when I go to Russia, I go to events where they have their high-achieving young people. They're young people that have the highest test scores in the country. They're young people that are the star athletes, and they're telling them, we want you to succeed. We want you to go out and build a strong Russia. Right? I'm telling you that I understand what's happening in the world today. And this isn't classical Marxism. If you just, classical Marxism, you got to read it. It's the foundations. Go and read Marx. Go and read Lenin. Read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Read Lenin on the national question. Read Imperialism and the Split in Socialism by Lenin. Right? Read Stalin and the foundations of Leninism. Read Marxism or Anarchism by Stalin. Read Mao talk on the question of philosophy, a brilliant, brilliant lecture that Mao Zedong gave in 1964 to a group of college students. Go and read the letter to the American workers that Lenin wrote. We have a whole textbook we created as the Center for Political Innovation. There's a whole bunch of classical Marxist texts as well as American text. Go and read. You gotta know the foundations. But I'm telling you, we're in a new ballpark now. Something new is happening in the world. It's imperialism. That imperialist system that Lenin described is dying. And this new thing that Lenin created to fight imperialism, that started with the Bolsheviks and has completely changed now. It doesn't look the same. It doesn't look like the Soviet Union no more. It looked different with Stalin. It looked different with Deng, and now it looks completely different. In some cases, it's very opposed to Marxism. But there's this new thing in the world that's battling the imperialists. And that new thing is something that we Americans need. The only way we can get out of that crisis that we are in as a country right now is if we embrace the new thing. We have to find our own form of the new thing here in America. We have to find a uniquely American version of this new thing. You don't want to call it socialism. I like to call it 21st century socialism, anti-imperialism, resistance economy, whatever you want to call it. The only way we can get out of the mess that our society is in right now is if we figure out how to make American version of that new thing. We need an American form of 21st century socialism. That's what we need. That's the only way we can get out of this. And no, it won't be social democracy. It won't be giving people free stuff to stabilize the economy. Definitely won't be fascism, creating concentration camps and, driving the population down with eugenics. No. The only way out of this is the American version of that new thing. Whatever you want to call that new thing, I call it 21st century socialism. I think it's socialism. Maybe you disagree with me. It's not socialism, Caleb. It's not socialism. No, it has a market sector. It's not socialism, Caleb. It's not a state-run economy run by a Marxist-Leninist party. Okay, whatever you want to call it. But that new thing that exists in the world today, that's the future. And the only way our country is going to get out of the rut it's in is if we adopt that new thing. And you can hate that new thing all you want, and you can hold up your Marxist books, you can hold up Mao and say, no, that new thing is not what it's supposed to be. Well, so what? None of the world is as it's supposed to be. Until we have full communism, until we have a world of vast material abundance without inequality, the world isn't going to be as it's supposed to be. The question is, are we moving toward that ultimate goal, or are we dying? That's the question. And part of this world is moving in the right direction. It's moving toward a new world. And part of this world is dying. And I see death all around me in America. I see homeless people on the street. I see bridges and roads that are falling apart. I see syringes. I see syringes in the subway station. I see piss and urine everywhere. I see people committing suicide. I see people who won't speak to their family members because of some stupid political thing. I see it. We have death over here in America. There's death everywhere. This country smells of death, hopelessness, pessimism, death. It's everywhere. And the socialism that we bring, we have to bring a socialism that's the antidote to that. So, that's what I believe. I just told you what I believe. Take it or leave it. That's what I believe. So, am I a genuine communist? Am I a genuine Marxist-Leninist? Am I true to the classical Marxist-Leninist principles? I don't know. But so what? So what? I just told you the way the world is, and you can take that and you can agree with it or you can disagree with it. You can accept it or you can reject it. That's what I believe. All right.